I think everybody is waiting with excitement because with the recent developments in Russia. And yesterday we all got together and we had a very interesting discussion with Robin. Robin, if you could give us sort of a historical overview of the period that you have been there and how you've seen the latest developments from a point of view of somebody who is not Russian but has been living for a long time but still retains, let us say, also the view of an Englishman. I think Sting said something that was about New York. I'm an Englishman in New York, you're an Englishman in Moscow.
Englishman in Red Square, I think, is the one. What I'll do, I just want to talk a little bit about the last 12 months and what that's meant in the Russian market, and then try and predict the next 3 years. We can reduce the last 12 months in the Russian market down to 7 key trends, I think. First one is, and most obviously that everybody's heard about, is sanctions. Actually, sanctions are very complicated. It depends whether they're Canadian, Japanese, US or European. But what they mean for us is no new money into Russia, basically. So it's a closed funding conduit. There's some stuff which everybody remarks on, what we call sanctions creep, which means it operates in very, very funny ways. You might want to unwind a securitization in Europe, but one US person somewhere in Luxembourg took one phone call once in relation to the deal and the whole thing is blocked. So it just causes huge frustration to our Russian clients and me. I've petitioned OFAC, Her Majesty's Treasury. So sanctions are a real pain, but as the chairman of Veneshtorg Bank said, they wound but they don't kill. Second trend, de-dollarization. Boy, oh boy, did we learn in Russia the power of the United States dollar and the power of the United States. So, I think it's no secret that we are, I say we, that Russian corporates, Russian government is looking to de-dollarize, whether it's selling oil we'll come to oil in a second, sell oil in different currencies. It's desperately trying to find a way, and that may be a long-term trend. Russia may not be the only BRIC that may be facing that issue into the future. Third trend, de-offshorization. That's been a long-term trend, and that's partly a perfectly legitimate OECD controlled foreign company type legislation. But given, the last 20 years, everything's been through Cyprus. Actually, it's a real attempt to bring money onshore, make sure taxes are paid, bolster, I think, the Treasury finances, because we're going to have to see state bailouts and state support. The fourth trend, pivot to Asia. For the last 20 years, Russia, post the Soviet interregnum, has fallen into line with the rest of the BRICS, more or less, by following the Anglo-Saxon way of doing things. I've obviously benefited hugely from that as an English lawyer, so no problem. But now it's facing a situation where maybe it needs to look away from the Anglo-Saxon models at the same time as it's looking away from the Anglo-Saxon funding conduits. Fifth trend, Russification. It's such a weird thing, and I say this and I've benefited it. Maybe I've got less of my career to come than I've had, so the way things are going. But, how weird is it that two Russian oligarchs, you go into a meeting like I've done before with Roman Abramovich, Oleg Deripaska, Vladimir Potanin, with one other English guy who doesn't speak Russian, and they all have to speak English. I mean, what's that all about? That's actually insane. That shouldn't be happening. I think we're going to see much more accelerated trend, quite rightly in my view, of Russification, more use of the Russian courts, which are not as bad as everybody says. I think that's exaggerated, particularly in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And just more use of Russian law. Without boring you with the details, there are various positive trends of reform of the civil code to introduce effectively freedom of contract. Sixth trend, obvious one, devaluation. So, it's one of the reasons the crisis is not so bad, because of the cost base of a lot of corporates has gone down. One of our biggest clients, Russian Aluminium, has actually done much better this year. We were able to secure a $10 billion refinancing at the same time as its cost base, and the aluminium price in dollars has gone up. So it's not all doom and gloom. Capital flight, I think that's the biggest risk right now. It's a massive acceleration of the trend of the last 10 years. What does all that mean? It's like sorry to excuse my language, it's like a shitstorm, isn't it? It's like everything's coming at you all at once. It's the worst time in the world. So I'm always minded, and I think our firm view, although I don't speak for Russia, and nor do I really speak for my Russian partners, of whom I'm the only foreigner out of 30. But I'm minded to take the view that this is the moment of maximum pessimism. It's hard to imagine what could be worse at the moment in Russia. Whether you believe it's got $136 billion of corporate debt to refinance by either this year or next year, and the figures are somewhat opaque and I don't understand them. It's a lot of money, so it's bad, right? If I read the Financial Times or the Daily Telegraph, you know, we are in the new Cold War. There's one thing I think is right that I observe is that Russia is not Iran. America cannot do to Russia what it did to Iran. Russia has survived many cold winters and many difficult scenarios. I personally think it will survive this one. I don't know how long it will take. I don't know if the United States will succeed in getting regime change. I do not know if Russia will become more or less of a closed or open economy, but I think it will survive. I'm going to sort of wind up by saying, and most of what I've said is actually largely irrelevant, not for the first time, because, you know, obviously I'm a lawyer, but I think it comes down to a very simple thing, and I've learned, frankly, in Russia, I've been in there for 12 years, and you can't really predict it. I always say the foreigner who says he understands Russia is either a liar or a fool. You know, I've been both, I think, in my time, but I've learnt finally. And it seems to me that either, on the one hand, and now I'm going to be a lawyer, on the one hand this and on the one hand that, either oil is about to be range-bound between 25 and 50, or it's going to go to 75 and 125. I think if it goes between 75 and 125 in the next 3 to 5 years, Russia's going to be just fine. It may be less liberal than, you know, some people may like, but I think it will survive and be okay. There may be many less foreign lawyers, there may be less American bankers in the market, but I think it will survive. If there's a prolonged period between 25 and 50, I think almost inevitably, notwithstanding the very high level of foreign reserves, foreign currency reserves and low sovereign debt that Russia has, I think it would face difficulties in raising money from China on acceptable terms to continue to survive the long, cold winters. And I think, frankly, nobody from Barack Obama, candidly, to Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin knows for sure what the next 3 years hold. And at the moment, the best judgment I can give you is the judgment of the market. I'm pleased to say that Russia is the best performing stock market in the world this year, up 27%. I believe that's an accurate observation of somebody who lives in Moscow. At the moment, a lot of the bad news is priced in. There's going to be a prolonged period of, frankly, a war of attrition, which may be more or less like the old Cold War, and I think Russia will survive and come through. One thing I think has come out this morning where I slightly disagreed with some of the people on the first panel, not this panel, on the first panel was it was unremittingly negative, and there was a slight suggestion that the Russians are almost looking for a fight at the moment. All I would say, without being political, is there's very much a school of thought that the West are not completely innocent in some of their provocations of Russia, and therefore there was no attempt to divert attention from bad economic news. The Russians kind of have ended up in this situation, not entirely blamelessly. You know, there's always wrongs and rights on both sides. So I think the Russians are probably also looking for some form of compromise solution, whether it's a Swiss cantonal solution in the Ukraine. But I'm actually relatively optimistic that over the next I think there'll be no progress for 2 years. I think in some point in the third year, there may be some form of, I think rapprochement and entente cordiale would be to say too much given what's happened, but some sort of calibration, equilibrium could come in.